Welcome. This is using the Enpublica data connector for Power BI Tutorial 1, Part 1. It is a video companion to the documentation that's available in the repo for the connector. And given that this is also the very first tutorial, we're going to spend just a few minutes kind of introducing what the connector is and why we built it. So the tagline there says, hey, this is a new data connector that provides easy access to over 1 million energy and economic related time series directly inside of Power BI. And the idea is if you've ever wanted to perform your own economic analysis, maybe you saw an article about inflation or employment, or you may be someone who manages corporate data but needs to integrate like a commodity price or some kind of leading indicator into that, hey, you're in luck. That's what this connector does. It's effectively a wrapper around two very popular data aggregators that provide an API, and we just wrap around those APIs to make it real simple to call that from within Power BI. Those two sources, by the way, are the St. Louis Federal Reserve Economic Database, or FRED, and then the Energy Information Administration, or the EIA, data source. There's a third source here called Enpublica. That's us. That's just a small set of supplemental data sets, including some time dimension goodness that's useful for performing economic analysis. Now, before we get started, let me backtrack just 1 second here and go to the home page for this connector. What you're going to want to do in this first tutorial, we're using data out of FRED. So each of these sources requires its own API key. So you have to go to their site, request the API key. Now you're going to need that to follow on in the tutorial today. We don't manage that key. It's stored in Power BI Desktop. It's transmitted to the respective data source, but we don't have that, so it's kept secure. But you do need the FRED source for today's tutorial. The other thing you need to do is you need to get our connector. Hey, long term, maybe this connector will one day be just natively part of Power BI, but for now it's new, it's in beta, so you're going to download it, install it. Two options: you can either do it automatically or manually. If you have admin privileges on your machine, I recommend the automatic option. You'll just click on this link here. It's going to push down a small file. You will open that file, and then it literally, after you hit yes and go through the welcome, the actual setup process should take just a few seconds, and then you're done. Okay, so back to the tutorial. I'm going to show you where we're going to launch from. We've just done this part. We talked about getting started. We're going to connect to FRED now. Okay, so I'm going to stop showing you this, and we're going to actually look at the demo. One thing I will recommend that you do is to use the starter report that I've built. It's going to save you a little bit of time. It's right here. It's just called Enpublica Tutorial Part 1 Begin. And so that's what I have open already on my desktop. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and first thing we're going to do, we need to get some data. So we're going to click on Get Data, and that's going to open up the Get Data dialog box. And when that box opens up, you can either look for us under Online Services, or you can just search for Enpublica. I'm typing ENP here. There it is. We'll click Connect. Since it is in beta, you'll get this informational window that you have to click on Continue for. And then what it's going to do is it's going to prompt you to pick an initial data source. So remember, we're a wrapper around 3 different sources. We're going to pick FRED. The first time you connect to FRED, we need your API key, so you need to provide us the key that you got from the FRED website, and that's a 32-character key. So you'll enter that here. If you happen to hit connect and hit an issue, maybe you dropped a character or something like that, hit that repo that I'm going to give you the link to. I've got a special article about fixing connections that are wrong the first time. That can be a bit tricky, but in this case, I hopefully have the right connector and all is well. So the connector is being sent over to FRED just as a test, and we're going to come back with this initial navigator. Now, the FRED APIs, there's lots of different calls that are out there. We've implemented many of them, not all of them, but the ones that we think are useful inside of Power BI. The 2 that we're going to use for today's tutorial include FRED Series and FRED Observations. So I want you to go ahead and check those, and then don't hit load, because we actually need to do something with these functions. So check those and hit transform data. And what that'll do is it'll bring up the Power Query Editor so we can actually call those functions. Okay, and inside the Power Query Editor, we have our two functions. By the way, if you see something that looks like a question mark or an arrow, it seems to be a gremlin within the query editor. Sometimes you just have to click on the function and hit refresh preview, and then all is well. We're going to start off here using this first function, Fred series, and it asks us to enter one or more series IDs. And so there's an example of how to call two. For today's tutorial, we're going to enter three. We're going to enter, see if we can biggie size that a minute, GDP, that's gross domestic product, unrate or unemployment rate, and then CPI, a common measure of inflation. Okay, so those are the three that we're going to enter, just comma separated. Now we're going to hit invoke, and that's going to bring back information about the series. What's the ID? What's the title? When do we have observations for, start and end date? What's the default frequency? What units is this particular series expressed in? When was this last updated? That type of stuff. So I want you to read the name of this query right now is invoke function. That's not very useful. Go ahead and rename this to Fred, underscore series. Okay, so we're done with that part. Now we're going to call the other function, which allows us to get back the actual data values or the observations for a series. And we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to enter the same three series, but we're going to append something special at the end of that last series ID. This time we're using an ampersand, and then we're going to say units equals PC1. And all that really is it's telling the Fred API to perform an additional transformation on us for us. We want to see not the value, but the actual percent change from year over year. Okay. There were some other there are some other parameters that we can use. We'll hit those in a later tutorial. For now, we're just going to stick with the defaults. And again, let's rename this function called to Fred series observations. Okay. And with that in place, we're ready to go ahead and close and apply and have this data brought in so we can work with it. So I'm going to hit close and apply and let that data get loaded up. Okay. After that data loads, the first thing we're going to want to do is go over and build a relationship between the two tables. So okay. We'll go to the model view, and we're simply going to create a relationship between using the ID from Fred series. We'll drag and drop that onto series ID under on the observations table, and that's just a simple one-to-many relationship there. So we don't have to make any other changes. So now we can go back to report view. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to highlight this visual, which happens to be a slicer, and I'm going to select ID. So that's the three different series. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select a table, and we're going to select some data about those series. So we're going to go ahead and get, let's see, how about ID and maybe title, observation start and end, maybe last update, default frequency, units, URL. And then you can do some things if you want to clean this up, if you want to rearrange some of the widths. I'm going to go ahead here into observation start, for example, and I could make that a shorter date format. I could do the same thing for observation end. URL, that's one just as a nice thing we can do. We can come in here and say, hey, that URL is actually a web URL. And then now, if I remember correctly, yeah, we've got a pretty nice little link. So if we want to, for example, gross domestic product, if I hit that link, that'll take me back to the Fred website. I can get a quick visual view of what that looks like. In any event, again, that's more metadata. So now let's look at the actual values themselves. I'm going to go ahead and select GDP here for a minute so we can filter this. Again, but with this line chart highlighted, all we really have to do is select date, and value, and we're good to go. So we can filter a particular series, and we can see the values for that particular series. Here, for example, this is unemployment rate. We can see how that changes over time. We can see the big spike during COVID, and then the subsequent recovery and what have you. But that's it. So pretty simple stuff in this tutorial. We've just kind of scratched the surface of what we can do. I highly encourage you to take a look also at the written write-up for this tutorial in that repo, which I'm going to post a link to. It's got a little bit more information about the FRED APIs and how those are used, and you can get links to look at some of the additional parameters you can pass in. There's some good stuff there. But what we'll do in our next tutorial is we'll use this as a starting point, and we'll learn how to add recession bars, which can be useful for performing analysis. So thanks so much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.